Thank you for joining us for today's webinar in collaboration with our friends at N-able and Cove Data Protection. Just a quick sound check. If you, hopefully you can all hear me. So my name is Helen Owens-Pope. I head up the global marketing team here at Loop1, and I'll be facilitating today's session. So before we jump in, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. So today's session is being recorded and we'll share a copy with you afterwards, typically within about 48 hours. As you'll have seen from the webinar invite, we will be running a live scenario-based session with a few interactive polls along the way. Fingers crossed they actually work, and we'd love for you to get involved. We have a limited number of the Polar Box callers to give away to webinar participants who attend a follow-up demo with us. So I'll provide more details later in the session. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A. We'll either pick them up as we go or address them at the end of today's session. Next slide, please, Costa. Now, I won't spend too long on a traditional Loop1 overview. Most of you on the call are already customers, so you know us pretty well. But I did want to briefly touch on how Loop1 is evolving. So as you've hopefully seen, we've recently gone through a rebrand with a new logo, a new website, but it isn't just a visual refresh, right? It reflects a broader shift in how we're positioning ourselves and, more importantly, how we support you. So historically, many of you will know us for our deep expertise in monitoring and observability, particularly around the SolarWinds platform. And that's absolutely remains a core strength for us. Here in EMEA, we have more than 25 years of experience. But as our customers' environments have evolved, so have the challenges they face, and so have we. Next slide, please, Costa. So today, it's not just about visibility, it's about security, resilience, recovery, and being able to operate confidently across increasingly complex environments. So we've been very intentional in expanding our capabilities across these areas. Alongside monitoring and observability, we're now supporting customers across a broader set of operational technologies, including cybersecurity and resilience, helping teams strengthen threat detection, compliance, and overall operational resilience, data protection and recovery, so ensuring systems can be restored quickly and reliably when something goes wrong. And of course, we'll be covering that in today's session. AI ops and intelligent operations, so reducing noise, automating responses, and improving decision-making. And network visibility and mapping to better understand dependencies and manage complex environments. And really, the goal behind all of this is quite simple: to help you operate more securely, recover faster, and make better decisions with confidence. And well, that brings us nicely to today's session, because one of the biggest gaps we consistently see, even in well-monitored environments, is what happens when something goes wrong. So with that in mind, I'm really pleased to introduce today's speakers. We have Costa Koustas, cybersecurity consultant at N-able. He'll be leading us through the main part of today's session, walking through the scenario and exploring how different recovery approaches impact outcomes. And we're also joined by Greg Forsyth, Principal Solutions Strategist here at Loop1, who many of you will already know, bringing additional perspective from what we're seeing across our customer base. So with that, Costa, I will hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. And I'll do as you did and just do a quick mic check and make sure everybody can hear me. But I guess the giggle there suggests you can hear me as well, Helen.
I can indeed.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Just a tiny bit of background on myself. Prior to joining N-able last year, I've been in the cybersecurity space for about 7 odd years now at this point, and prior to that, I was an infrastructure and security specialist in the NHS for about 15 years, or built up to that role after being there for 15 years at least. And so I've dealt with a large variety of infrastructure, backup and end user computing and networking type of projects. But obviously now my core focus is generally around cybersecurity and what we would deem as resilient strategies for our customer base. So thank you very much all for joining, and lovely to meet you. Greg, do you want to just come off mute and have a quick hello and introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, hi guys. So I'm Greg Forsyth. I'm the Principal Solution Strategist here at Loop1. I come from a technical background with SolarWinds and many other monitoring tools and in the configuration space as well. Yeah, so hopefully in a good place to join in with Costa today and give you some good insight into Cove.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Greg. So just as we get started, Helen, we said we wanted just to make sure that the polls are working before we get into this. So do you mind just launching the first poll and making sure that we can see responses and everybody can see those, please?
Well, indeed, yeah. Good reminder, Costa. I forgot that bit. So we're just gonna launch a quick fun one just to make sure everything's working on our side, because we do have about another 10 or so polls to run throughout the course of today.
Thanks, Helen. And I'll just set the scene as to what we're looking to do here. So a little bit of fun. Obviously, trying to do any sort of real simulation over Teams can be quite difficult. We'd love to do something similar with you all in person as a bit more of a roundtable where we can interact and talk through these things. But I guess the idea of this really is to get us thinking around what our business continuity plans look like when we focus around our backup and our strategies around those. So I can see the poll. I'm going to go for hot chocolate. If you guys have never heard of Canoops, it's one of my favorite hot chocolate shops. So I recommend that, but that's my response put in. And I guess, Helen, from the poll side, can you see other people responding?
Yes. So you seeing the results as well, Costa?
I am indeed. Yes, I can see there have been 7 responses so far.
T's leading the charge at the moment.
It's a solid drink. It's a solid drink. Cool. All right. So we've proved that those are working. So let's get cracking. So first question here. Before we get into the simulation, there's always a big question about this type of thing, right? What keeps you in your organization up at night? And I don't mean across the board and across the whole, I mean specifically around a recovery and business resiliency piece. Now, ransomware for a lot of people often is still their number one concern and priority, but equally, in your case, it could be that you've got maybe some aging hardware, and so hardware failures keep you up at night. Maybe you have some really strict compliance and auditor regulation pieces going on, and that keeps you up at night. Or worst case scenario, maybe you've got a business continuity plan there at the bottom. Your BCP plan hasn't been reviewed in a while, and you're maybe worried about the worst case scenario, what that might look like if you've not touched it for a while. Now, with that being said, there's obviously multiple different personalities that we expect to be on these types of calls. And again, if we were in person, this is the type of thing that would come out very quickly. But I generally think of, when we look at business continuity plans, you've got 3 types of people who want to be knowing about this. And actually, if we start at the bottom, the CFO, the owner, the person who is ultimately responsible for the business, their biggest thing will always be around what the impact of downtime actually means. Now, I facetiously put in the dollar impact of downtime there, but that could be impact for customers lost, not meeting supply chain requirements that you've committed to. But equally, it could just mean from a business resiliency perspective, if there is a extended piece of downtime, it may be that we're not providing services to business critical functions for other organizations as well. Now, equally at the top, the resilience seeker. Some people are mostly interested in not another tool or piece there. They want an overall strategy. So there is a personality who's going after not one tool to meet them all, but maybe a combination of things to make sure that their business stays afloat during an outage. And then there's the person in the middle who actually, everyone says disaster recovery is simple until failover day. I think this is almost like the Mike Tyson quote of everybody thinks they can box until they get punched in the face, right? So real world scenarios here for us to think about. And I will also pay, I have to submit my vote as well. I think it's for me to see if everything's going to go through. So I'm going to go with my BCP plan hasn't been reviewed in a while because I don't have one. Cool. Right. Hopefully everybody has had time to vote in those. So let's get going. And one of the things that I just want us to do is very quickly consider, we're talking about business continuity and business resiliency strategies here. Now, backups are the thing that ultimately drives the majority of this. And ultimately, a lot of business continuity plans will also have around if the building's on fire, if there's a flood, if there's a natural disaster, etc. But let's just focus in on the backups and why we should be paying attention to them. And in this particular scenario, we're going to focus on a cyber incident. But of course, it doesn't have to be cyber incident related. It could be one of the other reasons why we have an outage of hardware services or similar. Now, I'm not going to read all of these verbatim, but let's just maybe pick out a couple of points that maybe stand out and maybe resonate with yourself here. If we start in the top left-hand corner, backup and restore failures are still frequent. Now, these are not statistics that customers obviously are quite comfortable sharing, but when we've seen these come through from third-party surveys, the big one that stands out to me is nearly 4 out of 10 data recoveries fail. So let's forget the fact that 57% of jobs are completing, and that leaves a good, again, 4 out of 10 that aren't completing. It's the recovery piece that people are struggling with on a day-to-day. And that ultimately then lends quite nicely to the statistic here around actually outright from a ransomware perspective, less than 50% of organizations generally get their data back. And going back to that Mike Tyson being punched in the face scenario, backups often fail when they're actually being put to the test. And it's a really strong quote here. And you'll see there's a theme here of if you're not testing your backups or if you don't have a way of proving what your backups are doing on a day-to-day, something to really keep in mind, because clearly we need to be able to recover when we're put to the test. Now, with that being said, I won't read out all the statistics here, but less than 15% conduct daily backup checks. That should have said 7% of businesses never check their backups altogether. Are you one of those organizations? Are you somebody that tests regularly? Do you have a third party that's testing for you? Is there an automation piece that's taking place? Testing whether you can recover, I think, is actually more important than taking the backup in the first place, because this is where we start putting our business continuity plans to the test and where we start seeing the true outcome of these. And obviously, it's very easy to say go and do roundtable exercise, tabletop exercises for these, but this something needs to be built into our day-to-day, not just waiting for a user to pick up the phone and say they accidentally deleted a file or a server going offline. This is something that we want to be considering on a regular basis. Now, regulatory, based on the different customers that are here today, I won't pick on these in too much depth, but we're starting to see one big common theme out of insurers and regulatory bodies here, which is actually without evidence of immutable backups, one, and you performing recovery testing, two, then actually insurers are refusing cover. There's compliance that people are failing to meet. As you can see, NIS2 has the objective there for regularly tested backup and recovery. And this is all ultimately important to that final piece in the bottom left-hand corner, which is recovery. Even a well-tested recovery plan can take a very long time. And actually, when we think about the term RPO and RTO, recovery point objective and recovery time objective, the truth is a lot of organizations often completely miss those in their strategy because, again, they've never gone through that testing organic piece. Right, with that being said, let me introduce you to today's, I nearly want to call them victim there, but the organization that we're going to be basing this on. So we've got N-Corp Inc. They are a small mid-market sized organization. They've got about 200 users, only 4 IT staff, including the IT manager. They still have quite a mixed hybrid infrastructure. So they've got bits in Azure, they've got bits on-prem, they've got a third party that they're paying to do replication to as well. So they've got what would actually be deemed as quite a mature strategy when it comes to looking after their own infrastructure there. But the reality check of this here is that although the backups exist, and we can see we've got some nice backup appliances here and replication all over the shop, the truth of the matter is with only 3 real IT team members, they spend their time either doing project work or firefighting the calls that come through. Nobody really proactively or regularly checks or tests the backups for recoverability. And so from a security perspective, there's almost an assumption of we've ticked the box of we've got backups and we maybe receive alerts if they fail. But in the worst case scenario, security are relying on the fact that they believe they're covered. And when I say security, I'm looking at the same 4 individuals that are managing this on a BAU perspective. So normal standard organization, let's get to it. So first thing, Monday morning, conscious that we're at Wednesday today, but you'll keep with me here. Monday morning, somebody comes in and actually they've decided to check the backups. It's been a little while. It's been the end of the financial year. There's been loads of project work going on. And actually they've noticed that there's been a trend that although the backups haven't failed, there has been a slow ticker of incremental changes to how long the backup is taking. Now, again, in this user environment, 22 hours may be absolutely fine for how long a backup should take for their core application and business application servers there. But as you can see, it trickled up, it went down a little bit, and then it trickled back up ultimately at that previous week to over 24 hours in total. Now, this is where I get to ask the first question for yourselves, right? And this is an answer honestly type of question as opposed to what's the worst case scenario here. If you were in this scenario, if you were the one checking the backups, or if your team members were the ones checking the backups here, would you genuinely investigate this ASAP because you've got concerns that the backup would be failing? Or would it be something that we investigate later? Maybe we raise a ticket, we put it into the queue that we're going to come here and have a look at in the not too distant future, but it's not a massive priority at this stage. Now, Greg, I'm going to tap you in here for a quick second. Oh. From your perspective, and I know you deal, again, a lot with Loop1's customers, infrastructures and setups there.
Yep.
From your experience, what generally would see a backup take longer than previous? And I know you guys focus very heavily on the observability and networking side. So maybe humor me, what would you normally see making backups take longer?
Something's changed. I mean, pretty much always when we see outages or issues, it's due to someone making a change. Changes cause issues. So the first thing I'd be looking to is what's changed in terms of configuration. And I'd be checking into my storage as well. Obviously, if storage is taking longer to complete the backups, then I'd be looking into the storage space.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's actually really common, right? The first thing that we think is there a project that's taken place, a migration, a new application, an update? Like you say, has something changed and we just haven't accounted for it? And maybe it's just a blip as we get over the first set of incremental backups before it takes that wider sweep. And, you know, that's exactly why in most cases, most people would look at this and go investigate later.
Yeah, but, I mean, like you say, unless something's shouting at me to tell me that storage is broken or storage is filling up to capacity, then I'm putting that back in the investigate later, where realistically it should be in the ASAP category.
Yeah, and actually we think about the ASAP category. Let me put the cybersecurity hat on here rather than the changes. When we think about changes like this in an environment, actually this could be as a result of some backup tampering, so configuration changes. Maybe somebody's changed something on the backup. Still goes to your point around changes being made, but in this case, malicious activity or maybe accidental. It could be worst case scenario, something like a suspicious change in data patterns, right? So when we say data patterns, what do we mean? It could be slow encryption. We could be having somebody that's already in the environment. They could be moving around. They could be encrypting things bit by bit, or equally, they could just be leaving things behind, artifacts behind, maybe even exploit kits that they want to run later on. Maybe they've put their own VM on the infrastructure. Either way, back to your point, it indicates that something has potentially changed in the environment. Now, devil's advocate here, we're not going to go through the whole infrastructure, the whole incident response scenario here. Let's go straight to the punch, which is, yes, this was an issue where we've got an impact confirmed. We're actually the following week after somebody has started to investigate this, we started to see a load of users who are logging issues for access requests. So their password they think doesn't work. They can't get on the VPN from home, or if they have connected, they're not able to get to resources. Even their Office 365 has been taking a hit in terms of access here. and I tongue-in-cheek here say it's always DNS, right? We've had a number of outages in the last few months that have been nationwide, if not globally, right? And so if you're the first person that comes in at 7 o'clock in the morning in IT and you're just having a look through some of the logs, the first thing that you think of isn't always going to be ransomware or something malicious. But again, let's not beat around the bush. In this case, it absolutely is. We've got file shares that are encrypted. We've got Active Directory that's compromised. And we'll understand the scope of this a little bit further as we move forwards. But this is why we want to talk about backup, because at this point, if we were to stop and just think, if we can trust our backups at this stage, this should be a question that we haven't waited this long to pose to ourselves. But I think at this point in time, everybody will stop and think and go, okay, are our backups secure? And how do we go about checking some of those? And that's exactly what we're going to look to do moving forwards here. So in true fashion here, we're going to stop and ask, what would you do first in this scenario? So again, reminder, ransomware has been triggered across multiple servers, users are reporting access issues. From your perspective in your organization, or in this scenario, would you look to go ahead and start isolating all the systems immediately? Would you assess the scope and impact? Would you initiate a restore from backup? Or would you escalate internally and follow an incident response plan? Now, reminder here, putting the shoe on the other foot, this organization, again, only has 3 IT people. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning when this has been first discovered. So this is potentially just one person responding to this as opposed to a whole team. And whilst we vote for that, and again, I'm going to vote here as well, so I'll probably skew the results a little bit, and I'll hit a vote there. And I can see the majority of the responses. I'll give it a little bit more time. But just whilst we think about that, again, Greg, probably a great opportunity for me and you to talk a little bit about what these guys should be thinking about. I mean, again, generally speaking, from the customers you deal with, I appreciate you probably deal with a lot of infrastructure and network leads, but in disaster recovery scenarios, who, in your experience, generally makes the decision as to what to do first?
I suppose 2 sides of things. Maybe the incident manager on the technical side, the decision to do that. Well, we've also got the business owners as well who own the recovery, I suppose, in that sense. Especially in a small organization like the one in the scenario. So I mean, incident managers though would typically be the way I'd look to, and then obviously into the major incident management if we're going down that ITIL kind of route.
And you know what, you've hit the next question on the head there. You mentioned ITIL there, so framework for organizations, and you called out incident responders. I know not everybody adheres to ITIL. I think it's obviously a really great framework, and a lot of people use that. And we've got the gold and silver and bronze levels as well. When I've run these types of simulation in person with some organizations before, what was actually quite interesting is this third question, which is around who's actually empowered to make these decisions. So on the call today, we've got people of technical experience, we've got people who are in management level, but we've also got people who are engineers, right? So the question that I always pose in the room is, if you're an engineer and you're the person that's come in first thing in the morning, can you make this decision? Are you empowered to make this decision? And it was a mixed response in the room when I've asked this before, which was one organization said, yeah, absolutely. Everybody has a copy of the IR plan. Everybody knows who they escalate to. Everybody knows what they do. But also everybody is empowered to take that first choice based on what they think is best as well. Whereas the other side of the room actually came out and said, we don't want to burden our first and second line technicians with this during triage. The thing that they're empowered to do is pick up the phone regardless of what time of the day it is. So again, neither here or there, but hopefully interesting to think of, if this was one of your help desk staff guys on the call, what would they do? Do they know the process here? Do they feel empowered to call the head of IT if they're on annual leave, for example? Really good considerations for how people actually respond in this scenario.
I think it's important as well for those people that are making the decisions to have the right data in front of them, to have the right visibility of what's going on, and also know what options they have to take.
Absolutely. Now, the responses that have come through, I think the majority have gone for isolate the affected systems immediately. So really good, strong response. We've got a couple on the assess the scope and the impact. What I find really interesting is nobody has voted for initiate restore from backup, which again, from my perspective, is the right answer to not do. I don't start bringing things back up live, and we'll talk about why shortly. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for participating there. What we're going to do here is actually pretend as though incident response is being completely handled here, right? So again, small team, maybe they've picked up the phone and followed their incident response plan and it's been escalated. But actually, let's bring this back to maybe what the people who are dealing with the backup servers and solution are looking at here. So they've been told, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, by the board, who are potentially following their business continuity plans and IR plans, that whilst the threat has been contained and incident response has been engaged, actually number one priority here is to start restoring systems as a number one priority. Now, nobody voted for that on the previous one, and I completely understand why. But in this case, if you were told as part of the process, it's time to start restoring, where would you start? Or should I say, what would you do next in this particular case? Now, there's a lot of options here around cleaning malware, trying to restore files individually from folders and backups, some full image restores from backups. We've not mentioned earlier on, we called it out that there's a third-party backup disaster recovery site. So it could be an option here that we look to fail over there. But then there's E, which is actually validate what the backups look like. So are the backups infected? How far back do those backups go, for example, whilst they were potentially infected? It gives us some really strong question points. And again, Greg, maybe from your instance, do you get involved in many customers where they've had an outage and I guess they're looking to fail over to their DR site? Do you guys get involved with bringing some of that network connectivity back online, and what do you normally follow at that point?
I mean, we're always looking at DR, always looking at HA, all of those kind of functionalities in the observability space. Bringing things back online is critical, and obviously having those monitoring tools as well in that space to be able to see what's happening during a critical outage. So being able to fail over to see what's going on the side that's gone down. Do a lot of people have backup and DR solutions in place? Or are they tested? Not so much, we find. A lot of times when I'm putting into in solutions, I'm building in those DR solutions for them as well, or DR testing solutions as part of the implementation plan. But we find most people don't have those in place necessarily.
Yeah, that's completely fair. And actually, when, as you just mentioned, there, not a lot of people have these in place. I think often is the case that a backup solution might have been put in place, does what it does in terms it might be connected to the ESXi or the Hyper-V infrastructure and just take copy of the images as we go. And I think the almost assumption there is that that's almost enough. I used to work in an NHS building it was an admin office ultimately, but it formed as a data center. We had private links out to a health center where we did replication. And I'll be honest with you, yes, there were backup checks, but ultimately it was just to go, did it replicate to the other site? Is there any errors that I need to be aware of? But that is as far as the testing process went. And so they left quite a big gap. I'll just have a quick look to make sure as everybody voted for this poll. If I go to response details. So yeah, great to see that the majority have voted for validate if backups are infected. Really good, strong step here, which actually raises another point. We'll talk about it a little bit more later on. But the question that I always ask is, how do we validate if backups are actually infected? So when we think about maybe offsite DR, for example, do we have it where it's an area where it's completely disconnected from our network? Do we have offsite capabilities that we can restore to do, I call it DFIR, digital forensics and incident response, but it might just be what we deem as a cold room, which is completely disconnected. To me, the how we validate those backups are infected is a really important piece of that process. And again, something for everybody to consider today. If you are questioning how you validate this, what do you do in terms of standing this up? Where do you stand it up so that you make sure this isn't something that then can ultimately continue spreading, as it were? I think when I think back again, NHS days, WannaCry, unfortunately, there's often the case of people like, well, if you shut something down, how are you going to bring it back up and check that it isn't infected? The old school way was we still had a lot of physical servers, but obviously there was a lot of Hyper-V and virtualization there. Disconnect the NIC and actually then just console into the server and start running checks, which works in a way, but is also a very manual process. And not everybody might then have access to a console for an infrastructure if it's been disconnected from the network. We don't always know what somebody's break glass scenario might be. It might literally be disconnect the network card. It might be kill all network connectivity, or it might be to shut these servers down, which makes validating these backups more difficult. Now, that being said, this is more of a question outside of the scenario, but again, back to the audience. If you were to have this in your environment, and again, answer honestly here, right? There's no right or wrong answer. How confident are you, based on the testing that you do today, that you would be able to recover and be unaffected by this type of scenario? Now, I'm hoping I see a lot of very confident and somewhat confident responses here. But equally, if you're not confident, or maybe you're not sure because, again, not entirely sure when the last time you tested your backup is in place, it's not a wrong answer, right? This is all around just having these things brought to front of mind so that we know how we might respond should these scenarios happen. But actually, whilst that poll is running, one of the things that is probably, again, useful for us just to talk about here is we mentioned about when failover was last tested. So do we have a playbook that tests failing over to our disaster recovery site if we've got one? Is that failing over to the cloud, for example? Have we got VMs that are stood up in Azure, in AWS, in Google Cloud? But more importantly, as always with this thing, who is the person or the department that owns this in your environment? So is the business continuity plan completely up to date with the person who owns the backup and recovery process? If not, something that we really want to consider here. But the big one for me, actually, immutable backups. How do we know whether we have got truly read-only, unaffected backups? It's really easy to make the joke of, well, I've got a tape storage that I take offline and I flick the switch so it's read-only and I go to stick it in a waterproof safe. I know plenty of organizations are still doing that, of course, but the other side of this is, how do we prove something is truly immutable if it's just another copy of that on, say, another NetApp, or insert a storage vendor where we're taking a copy of that? How do we know that that hasn't been accessed, tampered with, misconfigured, for example? So really good question to be able to pose back to yourselves as to whether you truly have immutable backups in your environment. Now, great to see that the majority are somewhat confident. Although it is assumed and maybe not fully tested there. Something to, again, think about what you might want to do about improving those business continuity plans to include testing on a weekly, bi-weekly, or maybe as a minimum monthly basis. If we have a look at some of the NCSE guidance that came out of the annual report last year, one of the biggest failings was found that a lot of organizations, again, although were backing up, were unable to recover during a real incident. And so they really, really heavily emphasize that you should be testing your recovery process end to end at least once or twice a year. Obviously, just testing the backups is one part of this, but in the same way that we go and stand in the car park for our fire drill process, this is something that we should be keeping as part of our regular schedule.
Costa, how many people, or kind of what's the percentage of people do you see doing these tests, doing these failovers?
Honestly, if I were to take out the reports that I read and that we've had third parties do, every time I talk to a customer, it is, I'm going to say, very rare that somebody is physically testing and actually doing a recovery. What they might do is go and just spin the VM up on another hypervisor or similar, or they might do hypervisor migration because of hardware, making sure that things move over. But I'm yet to see anybody, and forgive me, real world experience, Anybody who's turned around to me and said, you know what, as part of our process every week, every month, somebody goes and spins up the business critical failovers, tests their processes, tests that the data is has got high fidelity, etc. I'm yet to come across that. But I know there's people that are absolutely doing that out there, but it takes time and resource, right?
Yeah, what do you think the main reason is for that then? Do you think that's technical complexities, the worry about the data coming back, what issues it might cause doing the DR failovers or the backup recoveries?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think when we think about how a lot of organizations have found themselves, often is the case that they might have inherited some infrastructure. And so it may not have been their baby to begin with, for want of a better term.
Yeah.
And so they keep it watered as opposed to know what a true recovery or resilience piece looks like. I always used to joke that for me to fully understand something, I learn by doing and ultimately breaking.
Same.
In some organizations, they may have never got to that point, so they've maybe never truly uncovered the cogs behind the scenes. And so for them to perform true backup recovery and resiliency testing, it isn't really going to happen until they're in that absolute break glass scenario. But probably more than anything, it comes down to time and resource. Just like security, a lot of people pay for managed detection and response services to provide that 24/7 coverage, not just because of a skills gap, but because of a time gap. Generally speaking, IT, infrastructure engineers, DevOps, etc., they've been brought in to do one job. I say one job, multiple jobs with the hat of the role that they have. And so some of these things that they fall to the wayside very quickly.
Yep.
Right, let's get back over into the scenario here. So we've already determined that everything now isn't in the best shape. We've had everything contained. We've gone to look to stand warm copies up of the mission critical VMs that are on that third-party disaster recovery site. But unfortunately, we discover that there's only the last 24 hours that have been made available as snapshots to restore from. And actually, if you think about how long this compromise has now been in that environment, we are now looking at backups that have been compromised. And the big kind of disclaimer here, it's always that almost moment. We checked these last week. Well, of course, when we checked, we were just checking runtime. We were checking that backups have been completed. There was no maybe notification that backups have been tampered with, where configuration changes had been made. And so actually the fact that there was potentially an adversary, again, or misconfiguration in some cases, where these configs had been changed, had unfortunately been missed. So for this customer at this point in time, their options are becoming more and more limited. But with that being said, let's just say we, by some miracle's sake, have found that there are some backups that have not been compromised, maybe some individual files and folders, and maybe some images, again, that haven't been touched based on the little bit of time that we've been looking at. Based on this customer, right, we've got a couple of options that we can fail over back to our local infrastructure again, bring us back online and try and accelerate that process. We've got the option to take them over to the third-party disaster and recovery site. That might give us that clean room consideration that I was mentioning before. But of course, let's also not forget they've got an Azure subscription. Could we spin things up into Azure to allow for connectivity that is completely disconnected from our infrastructure dependencies here? Now, for me, the Azure one feels like the most I'll say mature or modern way that a lot of organizations might think of this. But then equally, if they are not an organization that spins a lot up in Azure, the costs of spinning up VMs back in Azure, the restore times, the data being sent back up there might take a little bit longer than we might anticipate. And obviously, anything that costs us more money during this type of scenario isn't ideal. But again, Greg, maybe bring you back in here and something we can think about. And I know we've touched on a lot of these subjects as well. Do your customers, when you guys are helping with some observability and networking piece, do they generally help get you guys to help spin up a clean environment, i.e. where there's nothing available to be compromised in and use it for forensics, etc.?
Not typically. We spin up labs, we spin up test environments. But in terms of full-on DR kind of clean environments, not so much. We don't see too many of those. I think we should see more.
Brilliant. And I guess if we were to ask the question to the audience, and I know we can't respond to this one and participate, but we mentioned this earlier on, right? How many have got an air-gapped, clean environment? If you're in the fortunate position that you do, fantastic. If you're in the less, pardon me, fortunate position where you don't, the question to maybe pose here is, okay, so as part of what we're looking at right now, how do or where do we restore to that would give us an opportunity to validate whether a backup is clean or compromised? Is it something that we maybe have on a third-party retainer with an organization where we use their private data center to be able to spin these things back up? Just again, some consideration points for us in this particular customer's scenario. They're going to actually look to restore back to the local infrastructure because, again, they've got pressure from the board to bring things back online as quickly as possible. But, again, devil's advocate here, we're at that first backup being restored. And as we already mentioned, we've kind of had the realization that unfortunately, the majority of these backups have all been compromised. And so even the first one that they go to restore is something that has been hit with ransomware already. So an unfortunate scenario, but we wouldn't be playing the inevitable game here if everything was able to be clean and restored from out of the box. Now, with that being said, there's always a bit of a chance to do a bit of a reality check here. So let's just bring some context into this. Time is obviously ticking for this organization. We're already a week on from when backup started to originally take longer, but now we're starting to realize from some of the forensics that are taking place that the integrity for backup has ultimately been lost, and we're looking at least 70% of the backups are damaged or lost. Now, again, with this being said, if you were in these shoes, if you were in this customer's shoes, if you had this scenario, bearing in mind now that big disclaimer at the bottom, which is actually immutable and offline copies were never actually configured. What do we do next, right? We've got Office 365 that we were talking about, so that's potentially got some files and folders we can restore from. That's something that we mentioned earlier on, users were struggling to get access to. Do we actually halt all backup and restoration processes and just isolate further the backup servers to prevent further compromise? Or do we focus on what is available for business critical assets? So again, where all the crown jewels are sitting. And again, just some wider considerations for you guys whilst you fill in this poll here. And the thing for me here is actually everybody's organization is going to be busy in terms of what is determined as a priority. I've always got to put that question in there is at this point, 70% of backups and got full business outage. Is paying the ransom ever an option? I'll leave that one unanswered for people to have a think about. But going back to the recovery time and recovery point objectives, we're blowing through time here, right? If you've got a strategy that says the recovery point objective needs to be within the last 4 hours, 12 hours, for example, and the only backup we've got which isn't compromised is in the last 24 hours, and we're looking to restore that in a way that we have to ensure that it's clean, go through the clean room, etc. How are those RPOs looking from the business continuity plan that we've got in place? But the big one for me, which again, Greg, I don't know whether you've had similar. Whenever I stand up in the room, there's a bit of a penny drop moment. Not all organizations, thankfully, but when we say about backing up Office 365, there's often that moment of, isn't this all part of what's taken care of for me? I don't know if you've had the same.
Yeah, I think people think that it's backed up by standard, which we both know it's not, which leaves people a bit open. I don't know if I don't know how many people in the room obviously are doing the M365 backups, but yeah, it's a common thing that we see of people not being aware of their resilience within M365.
And it's a solid point for us to, again, all consider here. I do this a little bit tongue-in-cheek with this particular organization. We're deep into the afternoon, evening now as part of this process. They go over to Office 365 and they look to take a recovery. And I kid you not, this was a screenshot that I took when I was putting this together. I clicked on my own Office 365 piece, and the first thing it says is, hey, you don't actually back up. Would you like to pay for backup with some pay-as-you-go pricing? And again, unfortunately, the customers that I've done this in person with, there have been 3 or 4 out of a small room that have turned around and said, we've actually been through this ourselves. We went to go and pull a file that somebody had deleted. It wasn't malicious, from more than 30 days ago, and they found that actually what they thought was being backed up, what they thought was being kept for them, unfortunately wasn't. So with that being said, we're now completely out of options for this organization, right? At this case, there's no further recovery options. Unfortunately, this organization now is going to be looking at quite a catastrophic and lengthy rebuild process. But to the point, I guess this scenario has passed really quite quickly. I mentioned their 4-hour RPOs and 12-hour RTOs as we were talking here very briefly. But this, again, great opportunity to stop and ask you guys in the audience, what does your recovery point objective and recovery time objective look like? And again, there's no right or wrong answer here. I think everybody will work to different objectives here for what they're trying to achieve for either their own internal customer base or the supply chain that they work in. But whilst I was having a look at this, I thought it quite pertinent to bring through some Gartner statistics that talk about what the average cost of an outage is when we're looking at recovery time. Now, Gartner on average say it's $5,600 per minute on average. To me, that sounded like quite a lot of money, but actually, if we again go to a business that's selling something, small business, couple of hundred users, $25,000 an hour doesn't sound like too much in the real world. If you think that they can no longer transact, they can't sell their product, maybe they can't speak to their supply chain, they can't transact in many ways, different shapes or form. Larger organizations, we only need to look at what happened to some of the UK businesses last year. 300,000 per hour again starts to seem insignificant. And obviously this doesn't factor in penalties or fines. This is just something that a business has as a cost during this type of outage.
And you've also got to factor in potential loss of revenue for all the potential customers that you might miss during that time, for example, which could see that increase as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is something that is not always going to be the same for every business. I think we want to look to have the lowest RPO and the shortest recovery time objective as possible. But I think there's also one thing here, which is you can have different RPOs and RTOs for different criticalities in your environment. You don't need to say we need to go and stand up every single application and server within that short time period. We maybe just have a focus on the things that keep the lights on, that we can transact, which means we can continue to work whilst we recover.
Yep.
There's a couple of not determined in there from a results perspective. 8 to 24 hours, and in some cases less than 24 hours. So again, shows that this is quite a mixed spread when it comes to what you guys have in place. And again, no right or wrong answer, but just something to have a think about as we move forwards. Now, we're just coming to the end of this, so let's have a bit of a resilience reality check. And again, this is in your environment and goes back to the first question that we asked at the very top of this scenario, which is, if nothing was to change in our environment today, what would be the thing that actually would cause us the quickest failure point? Would it be, we mentioned it earlier on, a ransomware attack? Would it be that we've got aging hardware that could fail? Have we got some team members that are maybe overprivileged that could change something and cause an outage? Or actually, is it the final two here? We just mentioned RPO and RTO. Could slow recovery be the thing that we're not sure about because we've never tested it? The skeptical person in me here says that actually we've talked about a cyber attack and we always joke about the when, not if, should be top of mind. Backup and recovery should be the same here. So when will we need to do a full-scale recovery? Not if we ever need to do a full-scale recovery. And again, in this case, I think the majority of people often vote for the ransomware attack, but let's see where you guys have voted. And I guess, Greg, what would be, if you were thinking of the majority of your customers, what do you think would be the thing that would cause the most immediate failure in their environment?
I mean, I'm always likely to go with the human error side of things. This human error can be the thing that triggers other issues. We've got to remember that the human impact of things, clicking on a link within an email, or making a change to a system, or not securing a system properly when configuring it. They're all things that can trigger the biggest issues.
And you bang on. That's what the majority of people here have voted for, right? Human error. And to me, human error, it doesn't have to be malicious. It doesn't have to be deliberate.
No.
It can just be somebody with over privileges. I can't tell you the amount of times that I had small outages from even plugging in a rogue DHCP server. Something like that is really easily done in an environment. And so, again, being able to respond to human error, that's something that we want to still be able to have a plan for on how we recover quickly. So final question here for everyone just to answer in. We've talked about the ultimate worst case scenario, which is a ransomware outage. Now, we've also talked about dependencies on third-party disaster recovery sites, Azure backups, Microsoft 365 backups. But if you were to stop and ask the question of if disaster recovery effectively became something that you could just subscribe to, what would that change for your organization? Would it change nothing because you're fully fledged and everything's working brilliantly? Or actually, would you stop and go, actually, this changes a lot of things because right now we don't have the certainty that we want. We don't have the testing in place that we want. And actually, we definitely don't do recovery testing, at which point having it done for us automatically in a safe location for us would mean the world to us in terms of backup and recovery. Now, for me, I'm a positive person here, but I would say that if somebody were to completely take all of this out of my hands, absolutely, this would mean the world to me. So everything in this particular scenario, admittedly, there's a lot of other things that we need to be worried about in our day-to-day lives when it comes to IT management, etc. But let's see what everybody else has said for what this would mean to them. Yeah, I think everybody there has voted for it would mean quite a substantial difference. So upon us thinking about that, let's just maybe stop and have a bit of a reflection point. So I have gone through and maybe talked about some of these themes as we've been talking, but these are some pretty good questions that we can pose to ourselves internally, to management, to our engineers who may look after backup, to our providers that we maybe work with. If we just take the titles, understanding what our critical workloads are, how many of them, if any, do we need to be online within 1 to 4 hours? And actually, if they're not, going back to that CFO point, what's the business impact per hour of that being down? If we go over to the bottom right-hand corner, we've talked about what SLAs and liabilities look like for those data and securities. We haven't mentioned GRC here at all, governance, risk, and compliance, but we have talked about being compliant with frameworks. We talked about the NIS2 requirement to be able to prove that we've got recoverable and tested backups. And likewise, often we see the case now more and more with our cyber insurance providers. But actually, if you're somebody that provides services to a customer, I'm going to use the big food chain example that we saw last year, the supermarket chain. Think about the responsibilities that they had to their supply chain, not just to their direct customers, and what that meant. And likewise for the car manufacturer, they had as well. Where do you stand on how your business continuity plans not only affect how your people work internally, but also what does it mean for those that you work with should you be unavailable? And likewise, spin it the other way around. What is their commitment to you around their operative downtime and what that would mean should they fail to spin their critical resources back up within an optimal time period? So with that being said, I'm going to just use the last few minutes. We, at the top of the call, said that this is all around the backup and resiliency piece. So it'd be remiss for me just not to close out the session. And again, thank you very much, everybody, for your participation here. Did say we were keeping it quite lightweight. But let's just have a quick consideration as to how we could potentially add data resilience to data protection. I won't go through all the extensive details around what good backup strategies look like. What I will give you a quick inkling into is actually we mentioned, and this is what the nice cooler bags are ultimately based on. We mentioned that N-able have a backup solution called Cove. It's called Cove Data Protection. It's completely delivered as a service. So the idea being this is completely cloud hosted, looks to back up your Office 365, your servers, whether it's physical, virtual, endpoints, laptops, etc. Basically anywhere we can install an agent to, we can make sure that we can get the backups there. But the thing that stands out to me in these conversations is that the way that Cove backs up is that we look to back up as regularly as possible, all the way down to every 15 minutes. So when we think about our recovery point objectives and our recovery time objectives, the technology that we use behind the scenes, True Delta here, does block level changes of incremental backups as opposed to image-based backups. This means in the real world, where we're seeing 2 gig changes on a server, we are literally only transferring about 100 meg back to our backup, which means that we can do it more regularly and more often, which means ultimately in the worst case scenario, we can restore more quickly and more often as well, helping improve those RPOs. However, pardon me, saying that, the big theme of today is all about resiliency and recovery. So we're going to touch on disaster recovery as a service to close. But one thing to keep in mind here is that where we talk about third-party disaster recovery sites, where we talk about standby infrastructures, if you're somebody who wants to have your hypervisor, your ESXi hosts full of standby images, this is something that we absolutely can support with standby images, regardless of where you want those to be hosted. So you can just literally flick a switch and have a standby image ready and rocking for you as and when appropriate. However, with a big one that we can see there, disaster recovery as a service, this is actually taking this a little bit further. So rather than just relying on taking cloud backups and making immutable copies of those and having standby images in your infrastructure for those, the introduction of disaster recovery as a service for customers now means that we can stand by full infrastructures for organizations or just their business critical infrastructures in the N-able cloud. And all a customer needs to do is spin up a VPN connection, connect to those resources, and continue working as though they were still on the local infrastructure. Now, again, the great thing about this is that that means we're taking care of spinning up those infrastructures. We're taking care of making sure that the images are tested thoroughly so that when the image is spun up, there isn't a need to go and test whether the backup is valid or has any backup issues. We'll be doing that as part of the automated process. But the great thing about this is that for those that don't have a clean room or somewhere to go and restore and test whether their backups are infected or compromised in any other way, shape, or form, the great thing about this is that you can also stand this up in a digital forensics type scenario, clean room as well. You can stand up an image in our infrastructure with no internet connectivity, no network connectivity, and you can go in and see and run every check on your server to see that it's as it should be before flicking it over to live and establishing that VPN connectivity. So a really, really strong model to, as the name suggests here, provide disaster recovery as a service, which takes away all the pains and total cost of ownership for you guys to water this on a day-to-day basis. But ultimately, what it means, if I focus on the bottom piece here, is there's a predictable cost associated with this. It's a license cost, not an ongoing service cost. You don't have to pay somebody to keep this watered. You don't have to change based on ongoing storage increases or similar here. This is something that is designed by heart to from the scratch to be automated, simple to set up, and ultimately to be able to fall back onto in that true break glass scenario so that you can just flick a switch and within less than 15 minutes be connected back to a live version of your infrastructure, i.e. connecting you back and minimizing those recovery time objectives that we've been talking about throughout today.
So, Scott, does that let me both connect to my VPN or connect a VPN instance to my DR site whilst also recovering that data as well?
Absolutely. So the idea is that in that disaster recovery site that we are hosting, that standby image will be ready to rock. So we don't necessarily need to recover. One of the things that we can do, though, whilst we have stood that infrastructure up, it means that we can now start recovering the image back on our local infrastructure so that once we're ready, we can do that failover. So yes, you can access it, you can continue to back it up as you're using it in our cloud, and then you can recover from it directly on your infrastructure and do that switch over again.
And that's pretty powerful. That's pretty powerful.
yes, takes away a lot of the headache. And again, because it's turned on and by design, and it's just a couple of things to be able to configure. The idea here is that it's not something then that just falls to the wayside and gets forgotten about in the worst case scenario. Now, admittedly, today we've kind of gone through this really quickly, and ultimately one of the things that we said as part of the incentive here, if this appeals to you, if you want to see and hear more about the Cove backup solution and what disaster recovery as a service, or even some of the standby image or Microsoft 365 backup capabilities look like, if within the next 30 days you book a follow-up session with us, we'll scope out your environment, we'll talk about where we may be a good fit, but ultimately show you what the solution looks like. That's something that we can do with you, and obviously that makes you then eligible for this lovely polar box that has been put on the screen here. But Helen, is there anything else that you'd like to add on here that I might have missed?
No, only just obviously just to get that call booked in, just reach out to your account manager. If you're unsure who your account manager is, you can reach out to me. There are terms that apply. If you scan the QR code, you can see what those are. But yeah, we only have a limited number. So the quicker you get your call, your follow-up meeting scheduled in, the quicker you can have this in your hands for the nice weather that's going to be coming up shortly. We've had a taster of it for the last couple of weeks. Summer's just around the corner, so great addition for your alfresco dining plans over the summer break.
Using the nice weather as a plug, I love that.
Absolutely, got to get one in there somewhere, that's for sure.
Fantastic.
But yeah, appreciate your time, Costa. Fantastic session, incredibly insightful. The polls worked. Yeah, I couldn't be happier from that perspective. Greg, yeah, appreciate your perspective, certainly from a Loop1 client perspective. Thank everyone for joining us today. I will share a copy of the recording. I will also share a copy of the slides and just link in terms of how to book that one-to-one meeting as well. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for everybody for joining. Have a great rest of the week.
Cheers, guys.
Have a good one, guys.